The last thing you want to worry about on your cruise vacation is being kept up in the middle of the night or woken early in the morning from loud noises entering your cabin. Every cruise ship, no matter how luxurious, has hundreds of problem cabins above a nightclub, below the leader deck, or beside noisy equipment that lets in a lot of noise. If you're sensitive to loud noises like me, you want to avoid these cabins at all costs because with most ships sailing with every cabin occupied these days, it's more difficult than ever to get moved. In this episode of the Chill Cruiser, I'll show you how to avoid noisy cabins and what you can do if you end up getting stuck with one. Hey cruisers, Andrew from Ottawa, Canada here. Welcome to the Chill Cruiser, where I review cruise ships from a chill perspective. Today I'm going to talk about noisy cabins, how to avoid them, and what to do if you end up getting stuck with one. I've sailed on more than 50 cruises on most of the North American lines, and I've been in my fair share of cabins with everything from screeching deck chairs from dawn till dusk to pipes making a loud flushing noise every 5 minutes throughout the night. I've also been in a few cabins with balconies located next to exhaust fans so loud that you couldn't hear the ocean. Every cruise ship, no matter how luxurious, has undesirable or less desirable cabins like this. The bad news is that if you're a light sleeper or sensitive to loud noise, being stuck with one of these cabins can really put a damper on your vacation. Even worse is that with most cruise lines offering promotions where the third and fourth guest can sail free, more often than not, you're going to be sandwiched between cabins with 3 or 4 people crammed into a very small space. I let my travel agent select my cabin on 2 recent Princess cruises, and both of them just happened to be under the leader deck with chairs screeching above me every couple of minutes, starting at 5 in the morning, and it drove me crazy. On another cruise, my cabin was next to a lovely couple who allowed their 2 toddlers to slam the cabin door, stomp on the floor, and scream in the cabin all day and night. The good news is that with the tips I'm about to share, you can significantly reduce the chances that you'll ever have to worry about noise. But if you do end up getting a noisy cabin or noisy neighbors, I also have some tips to keep in your back pocket that have helped me get moved to a much quieter cabin 90% of the time. If you're sensitive to noise and the thought of being in a noisy cabin gives you hives, then my first tip is to avoid guaranteed cabins and in most cases, upgrade bid programs. In both situations, the cruise line can assign you any cabin in the category you choose or above. Sometimes the cruise line will proactively assign and upgrade cabins well in advance of your sailing and give you one in a desirable location. But chances are high they'll wait until closer to the sailing and assign the leftovers that people who did their research didn't want. When it comes to bidding on upgrades, the higher the category, the higher the likelihood that every cabin will be in a desirable location. So if you're thinking about a suite guarantee or bidding on a suite, there's less to worry about than if you're looking at categories like ocean view or balcony. With the popularity of upgrade bid programs, the chance that you'll be upgraded without putting any money on the table in advance is low. But it can happen, and sometimes that surprisingly can be a bad thing. Unless you specifically set your booking to decline upgrades, the cruise line can upgrade your cabin automatically and move you to a new cabin, which releases the cabin you originally booked. This has never happened to me, but I've heard of this happening several times to people who carefully selected their original cabin, and after the upgrade, they weren't able to get it back. So if you want to minimize the risk of noise and surprises, make sure you tell the cruise line or your travel agent to set your booking to decline automatic upgrades. My second tip is to spend some time reviewing the deck plan to find out where the main public spaces like the leader deck are located and to understand what all the symbols mean for each individual cabin before booking. The best way to avoid noise is to make sure there are no public or crew spaces above, below, beside, or across from your cabin. The 2 public areas you want to avoid the most are the amenities on the leader deck and the venue that's used for the nightclub if they have one. On my recent British Isles cruise on Regal Princess, my Princess booking agent had selected cabin M424, a mini suite on Marina deck. If you search for that cabin on the deck plan and then look on the deck above, you can see it's the public section of the leader deck, which is a red flag. Another red flag is that there's this large overhang. Because I didn't do my research, I accepted the cabin and not only could hear chairs screeching every couple of minutes, the view from the balcony was heavily obstructed by that massive overhang. While I was on Celebrity Summit a few years ago, I met a few people who were in this small group of cabins on deck 10 and could hear loud thumping noises all night. Again, if you check the deck plan, you can see that it's directly below the Sky Lounge, which is the venue used for live music in the evenings and the disco well into the night. I was on Holland America's Conning Dam and assigned cabin 6102 right by the elevator lobby, which isn't exactly undesirable, but less desirable since there's a lot of foot traffic. Since I was booking last minute and there wasn't a lot of options, I went ahead with the cabin. But what I didn't realize was that in this wall section was a storage cupboard, which happened to be where the stateroom attendants congregated throughout the day, and you can hear their conversations in the room starting very early in the morning. One public space I've been above a few times that creates a lot of noise that fortunately didn't make it into my cabin was the main theater. I was on Sky Princess and didn't realize until after the cruise that we were directly above the main theater. I was below the theater on Sun Princess, and besides a very faint hint of bass every now and then, it was fairly quiet. So if I had a choice between a cabin below the leader deck and above the theater, I would definitely choose the cabin above the theater. Another thing to watch for in the deck plan is connecting cabins, which usually means there's a door to the cabin next door in the wall that brings in a lot of the noise from that cabin, even if it's not very loud. I've had connecting cabins a few times and could hear faint noises like the twinkling of room service cutlery or the entry door closing, which felt like my neighbors were essentially in my room. There are some exceptions, like on most of Celebrity's beautiful Solstice-class ships, where a special door in the entryway that's shared by both cabins can close to connect them, meaning there's no door inside the cabin itself that can bring in noise, which I think is ingenious. You can usually tell if a cabin has the connecting door if it has a short line going between it and a neighboring cabin on the deck plan. On Holland America's deck plans, connecting cabins have a plus sign in between the two cabins, just outside the diagram. For Princess ships, you can see all connecting cabins on a particular deck at a glance by selecting the Connecting Cabins checkbox. If you're looking at the details of a specific cabin, you can also tell if there's a cabin number in the Connecting Cabin field. If you're curious about a particular cabin, some cruise forums maintain a log where you can search for detailed reviews of each cabin. For example, on the Celebrity forum on Cruise Critic, there are spreadsheets for each class of ship that you can use to research in advance of your cruise and add your experience after your cruise. You can find links to those forums and other helpful cabin research tools in the description and on my website, thechillcruiser.blog. Let's move on to what you can do if you notice during your cruise that you're in a noisy cabin. The first thing to do is make sure what you're hearing isn't a one-off. Sometimes there are a lot of noises you only hear during the craziness of embarkation day. But if you repeatedly hear the same noise, my advice is to go to guest services as early as possible after embarkation is over, and they know who has and hasn't made it to the ship. I've learned that the earlier you ask, the higher your chances of getting moved. When I had that noisy family next to me, I thought I'd give them the benefit of the doubt and hope that things calmed down. Well, things only got worse, and by the time I went to guest services several days later, there were no cabins in my category left, just insides when I had a mini suite. With those third and fourth free guest promotions, most ships are sailing full with no free cabins. But on most cruises, there are a few no-shows or people who have to disembark the cruise for various reasons. You want to make sure your name is first on the list to get those cabins when they become available. In most cases, the folks in guest services are very accommodating and they'll work with you to try to move you. If you get the sense that the person you're talking to just doesn't want the hassle of helping you, or they tell you to come back later, that's the cue to ask to speak to the guest services manager, who's ultimately the person who's going to decide on who gets cabins that are freed up anyway. With so few cabins, you have a lot of competition, including people who want to pay to upgrade. So the last thing you want to do is wait to come back the next day. Back to those Princess cruises I mentioned earlier where I had cabins under the leader deck. On both cruises, I went to guest services early on the second day. On Ruby Princess, we were quickly moved to a slightly higher category, and on Regal Princess, after 2 days of back and forth, we were eventually offered the option to downgrade from a mini suite to a balcony, which they said was the only option available after guests had disembarked. Since the cabin was quieter and much brighter without that large overhang I mentioned, my friend and I took it, and we were much happier. If the guest services manager isn't able to move you for whatever reason, then there are a few things you can do to try to salvage the vacation. The first is to ask for compensation. Management's usually very well aware of the undesirable cabins above the nightclub or below screeching deck chairs. They're usually sympathetic to guests who politely complain about them and are empowered to provide compensation. If they don't proactively offer you any, sometimes all you have to do is just ask. Compensation can come in the form of onboard credits, complimentary specialty restaurants, and/or future cruise credits. If you're stuck with a noisy cabin, something I found that helps is to play white noise on a speaker or headphones. Guest services can also usually offer free earplugs on request. After more than 50 cruises, I've learned a lot of other tricks to save time, money, and grief while cruising. You can find my video with the top 10 tricks here. Thank you for watching, and happy cruising.